January 30th, 1944, Mignano, Italy. The morning fog clung to the hills around Mignano like the breath of death itself, thick and suffocating in the bitter January cold. Obergefreiter Hans Dietrich pressed his face against the narrow observation slit of his concrete bunker, watching American forces maneuver in the valley below through field glasses that trembled not from the cold, but from the persistent rumble that had been shaking the earth for the past hour. The sound was unlike anything he had experienced in 2 years of fighting, not the familiar shriek of incoming 155mm shells or the distinctive whistle of mortar, but something deeper, more ominous, a bass note that seemed to emanate from the bowels of the earth itself. Dietrich had survived Stalingrad. He had endured the grinding retreat across Ukraine. He understood artillery, its patterns, its limitations, its finite capacity to truly damage well-constructed German fortifications. The bunker that sheltered him and his 12 comrades was a testament to German engineering excellence. Reinforced concrete walls 4 feet thick, steel-reinforced observation ports, and underground supply tunnels that could sustain the garrison for weeks under the heaviest bombardment the Allies could deliver. Or so they believed. 3 kilometers away, concealed behind a ridge that afforded perfect protection from German counter-battery fire, the crew of Baker Battery, 697th Field Artillery Battalion, was making final preparations for a demonstration that would forever alter the psychological landscape of warfare. The weapon they served was not merely larger than conventional artillery, it represented a quantum leap in the application of industrial might to the science of destruction. The 240mm Howitzer M1, nicknamed the Black Dragon by its crews, stood 27 feet long and weighed more than 64,000 pounds. Its 360-pound shells contained enough high explosive to level a city block, and it could deliver these massive projectiles across 14 miles with accuracy that defied the comprehension of anyone who had not witnessed its capabilities firsthand. What Hans Dietrich could not have known, as he watched the Americans through his field glasses and felt the strange vibrations growing stronger beneath his feet, was that he was about to become witness to the birth of a new era in warfare, one in which no fortification, regardless of its construction or strategic positioning, could provide sanctuary against the overwhelming industrial superiority of American military production. The comfortable assumptions that had sustained German defensive doctrine since the previous war were about to be shattered as completely as the concrete walls that surrounded him, leaving behind only smoking ruins and the recognition that warfare itself had been fundamentally transformed by weapons that transcended conventional military understanding. The deep rumble that had been troubling Dietrich's morning was the sound of American democracy preparing to speak in its most elemental language, the mathematics of high explosives delivered with precision across vast distances by weapons that embodied the complete mobilization of an industrial society for the purpose of projecting overwhelming force. The age of the impregnable bunker was ending, and its demise would be announced by the roar of a gun that represented everything most revolutionary about American military technology. This moment at Mignano marked more than the beginning of another artillery bombardment. It represented the collision of 2 fundamentally different approaches to warfare. German strategy relied upon defensive engineering, tactical superiority, and the assumption that well-constructed fortifications could provide absolute protection against enemy fire. American doctrine embraced technological innovation, industrial abundance, and the belief that no obstacle could withstand the concentrated application of superior manufacturing capacity and scientific methodology. The outcome of this collision would determine not just the fate of individual battles, but the entire future trajectory of military conflict. In the modern age, the transformation that began in the hills around Mignano would ripple through German military consciousness with the inevitability of a natural disaster, leaving defenders to confront a reality in which their most cherished beliefs about the nature of warfare had been rendered obsolete by weapons that operated beyond the scale of human comprehension. The Black Dragon was about to deliver its first lesson in American industrial supremacy, and that lesson would be written in concrete dust and twisted steel across the length of the Italian peninsula, announcing to the world that the age of fortress warfare was over. As Hans Dietrich adjusted his field glasses to better observe American positions, he had no way of knowing that within minutes his bunker would cease to exist, along with every assumption he had ever held about the protective power of reinforced concrete and German engineering. The 240mm howitzer was preparing to demonstrate that American industrial democracy possessed the power to obliterate not just physical fortifications, but the very concept of impregnable defense itself, speaking with a voice so loud and devastating that it would echo through the nightmares of German soldiers for the remainder of the war. The morning silence that preceded the first salvo carried within it the weight of historical transformation, as two philosophies of warfare prepared to meet in a collision that would determine whether German defensive expertise could withstand the overwhelming material superiority of American war production. In bunkers across the Italian countryside, German soldiers continued their routines, maintained their equipment, and trusted in walls that had never been breached, unaware that those walls were about to become monuments to the obsolescence of everything they represented about the nature of modern military conflict. The context that made this moment so significant extends far beyond the immediate tactical situation to encompass the fundamental question of how industrial societies could project military power in the age of total war. Germany had entered the conflict confident that tactical superiority, defensive engineering, and operational innovation could compensate for enemy advantages in raw material production and manufacturing capacity. The 240mm howitzer represented the American answer to that confidence, a weapon system that embodied the complete transformation of democratic society for the purpose of achieving military victory through technological supremacy rather than human sacrifice. German military doctrine in 1944 still reflected the lessons of the previous war, when artillery bombardments, regardless of their intensity or duration, had failed to eliminate well-constructed defensive positions. The Hindenburg Line had withstood months of concentrated Allied bombardment, and German engineers had applied those lessons to create fortifications that they believed could resist any conceivable artillery attack. What they had not anticipated was the American capacity to produce weapons that existed beyond the parameters of conceivable artillery attack. Guns so massive and precise that they could eliminate specific targets with mathematical certainty while operating from positions that placed their crews beyond the reach of any possible retaliation. Hans Dietrich's bunker represented the pinnacle of German defensive engineering: concrete poured to exacting specifications, steel reinforcement calculated to withstand the most powerful conventional artillery, and firing positions designed to provide maximum protection while allowing effective engagement of attacking forces. The men who had constructed this position had studied every lesson of modern warfare and built their fortification to exceed those requirements by comfortable margins. They had not, however, calculated the effects of a 360-pound artillery shell, traveling at more than twice the speed of sound and carrying enough explosive power to excavate a crater 40 feet in diameter. The American artillery crews preparing to engage this target approached their task with the methodical precision of industrial workers operating sophisticated machinery. The mathematics of long-range precision fire had been reduced to routine, Calculations that accounted for every variable from air temperature to the rotation of the Earth itself. The 240 mm howitzer was not simply a larger version of conventional artillery pieces, represented the systematic application of American engineering expertise and manufacturing precision to the problem of eliminating specific targets at vast distances with surgical accuracy. What made the 240 mm howitzer particularly devastating was not just its size or destructive power, but what it represented about American industrial capacity and technological innovation. Each shell cost more than most German soldiers earned in a year, but that single shell could accomplish what hundreds of conventional artillery rounds could not: the complete obliteration of a heavily fortified position with mathematical certainty. The weapon embodied the American approach to warfare, assumption that any technical problem could be solved through the application of superior engineering and unlimited manufacturing resources. As the morning progressed toward the moment of firing, the psychological foundations of German defensive strategy were about to be challenged by weapons that transcended conventional military understanding. The comfortable assumptions that had sustained defenders through months of Allied bombardment were about to be shattered as completely as the concrete walls that provided their physical protection, leaving survivors to confront the reality that American industrial democracy possessed capabilities that exceeded their ability to comprehend or counter through traditional military means. The 240 mm howitzer stood ready to deliver more than explosive destruction. It carried within its massive steel construction the accumulated might of American factories, laboratories, and engineering expertise, all focused on the singular purpose of demonstrating that no fortification, regardless of its sophistication or defensive advantages, could provide protection against the concentrated industrial power of a fully mobilized democratic society. The age of the impregnable bunker was about to end, and its ending would be announced by weapons that spoke in the voice of American abundance with an authority that no concrete wall could ignore or withstand. First-time German soldiers heard the distinctive sound of an incoming 240 mm shell. They dismissed it as equipment malfunction or enemy propaganda. The whistle was too deep, too prolonged, too impossibly large to represent actual artillery fire within their understanding of what was technically possible. Veterans who had survived years of combat on multiple fronts found themselves confronting audio evidence of weapons that existed beyond their conception of conventional military parameters, carrying within their sound the promise of destruction on a scale that challenged their fundamental assumptions about the nature of defensive warfare. German intelligence reports in early 1944 consistently underestimated American artillery capabilities, partly due to the natural tendency of military organizations to assume that enemy capabilities mirror their own limitations. German artillery, while accurate and well handled, had been constrained by resource shortages and the overwhelming demands of the Eastern Front. German officers could not conceive of an enemy possessing artillery pieces that fired shells weighing more than most German guns weighed in their entirety, operated by crews who consumed processed food from factories thousands of miles away, while German soldiers subsisted on ersatz coffee made from acorns and bread stretched with sawdust. This fundamental misunderstanding of American industrial capacity extended beyond simple military assessment to encompass a complete failure to comprehend how total war had transformed the relationship between civilian production and battlefield effectiveness. While German forces were learning to improvise with whatever materials they could salvage from their collapsing war economy, American artillery units operated with the assumption that any technical challenge could be overcome through the systematic application of superior engineering and unlimited manufacturing resources. The 240mm howitzer represented not just a weapon system, but an entire industrial ecosystem dedicated to the projection of overwhelming force across vast distances with unprecedented accuracy. The psychological impact of facing such weapons would prove to be as devastating as their physical effects, challenging German soldiers' understanding of what was possible within the framework of conventional military action. Veterans who had maintained morale through years of increasingly desperate circumstances would find themselves confronting evidence of American technological superiority so absolute that it rendered continued resistance psychologically impossible. The concrete walls that had provided both physical protection and psychological reassurance were about to be revealed as illusions, leaving defenders exposed to forces they could neither comprehend nor effectively counter through traditional military means. Hans Dietrich's final moments of confidence in his bunker's protective capabilities represented the end of an era in military thinking, the belief that defensive engineering could provide absolute sanctuary against enemy fire. The 240mm howitzer was about to demonstrate that American industrial supremacy had rendered such beliefs obsolete, delivering lessons in modern warfare that would echo through the concrete dust of shattered fortifications across the entire length of the Italian peninsula and beyond, announcing to the world that the age of impregnable fortification was over, ended not by gradual evolution, but by the thunderous voice of American democracy speaking its most elemental truth, that freedom, when fully mobilized for war, possessed the power to obliterate any obstacle that tyranny could construct. At 1147 hours on January 30th, 1944, the first 240mm shell fired in anger began its ballistic journey toward Hans Dietrich's bunker. Carrying with it more than high explosives, it carried the concentrated industrial might of American democracy, the accumulated expertise of American engineering, and the promise that no fortification, regardless of its construction or defensive advantages, could provide sanctuary against weapons that embodied the complete mobilization of free society for the purpose of achieving military victory through technological supremacy rather than human sacrifice. The age of fortress warfare was ending, and its conclusion would be written in mathematics so precise and destruction so complete that survivors would struggle to find words adequate to describe what they had witnessed. The transformation of warfare that began at Mignano would continue across 2 continents and 3 years of conflict, as German defenders gradually came to understand that they were not merely fighting an enemy army, but confronting the full industrial and technological power of American democracy expressed through weapons that transcended their understanding of what was militarily possible. The 240mm howitzer had become more than artillery, it was democracy itself, speaking in the language of high explosives and precision manufacturing, delivering a message that would echo through the ruins of the Third Reich with the authority of mathematical certainty and the finality of industrial supremacy applied to the ancient art of war. The sound that Hans Dietrich heard growing louder in the Italian morning was not simply the approach of another artillery shell, it was the voice of the future announcing its arrival, carrying within its impossible dimensions the promise that the age of defensive warfare was ending and that American industrial democracy possessed weapons capable of reshaping the very foundations of military conflict through the simple expedient of overwhelming technological superiority delivered with surgical precision across vast distances. The Black Dragon was about to speak its first word in a conversation that would continue until the last German bunker fell silent and the Third Reich itself became nothing more than smoking ruins and fading memories of a time when men believed that concrete walls could provide absolute protection against the concentrated fury of free nations fully mobilized for the prosecution of total war. The 240 mm shell struck Hans Dietrich's bunker at 11:49 hours and 17 seconds, traveling at 1,847 feet per second after completing its 4-mile journey through the Italian sky. The 360 pounds of steel and high explosive detonated with a force that converted 8 feet of reinforced concrete into molecular vapor, creating a crater 35 feet in diameter and eliminating every trace of what had been considered an impregnable defensive position. Dietrich and his 12 comrades were killed so instantaneously that their nervous systems had no time to register the experience of dying. Transformed from living soldiers into constituent atoms by temperatures that briefly exceeded those found in the core of stars, American forward observers, watching this strike through field glasses from their concealed positions, reported results that exceeded even the most optimistic projections of the weapon's effectiveness. The bunker had not been damaged or disabled, it had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only a smoking crater and scattered debris that bore no resemblance to the massive fortification that had occupied the site moments before. The psychological impact of this demonstration was immediate and profound, as German radio intercepts revealed communications filled with shock and disbelief at destruction, so complete that it challenged the vocabulary of military reporting. The systematic application of 240 mm howitzer fire throughout the Italian campaign would establish a pattern of psychological as well as physical destruction that fundamentally altered German defensive calculations. Positions that had been considered absolutely secure were eliminated with surgical precision, leaving survivors to confront the reality that no fortification could provide protection against weapons of such overwhelming power. The mathematical certainty with which American artillery eliminated specific targets demonstrated a level of technological superiority that transcended conventional military capabilities to approach the realm of mechanical omnipotence. German prisoners captured during the weeks following the first 240 mm strikes consistently described their experience in terms that reflected profound psychological trauma. Veterans who had survived the most intense combat of the war found themselves psychologically incapable of processing destruction on such a scale, leading to descriptions that portrayed American artillery as forces of nature rather than manufactured weapons. The linguistic transformation reflected the complete breakdown of German defensive doctrine in the face of weapons that operated beyond the parameters of conventional military understanding. The industrial abundance that made such weapons possible became a recurring theme in German prisoner interrogations, as captured soldiers expressed amazement at the quality and quantity of American equipment they observed during their brief captivity. Even American prisoner uniforms were manufactured to standards that exceeded German officer clothing, while the rations provided to captured Germans surpassed in both quantity and nutritional value the food available to German soldiers in active combat units. The casual confidence with which American soldiers handled sophisticated weapons and equipment reflected a level of material support that German forces had never experienced even during their early victories. The can of Campbell's tomato soup that American artillery crews consumed during their brief rest periods between fire missions represented more than simple sustenance. It embodied the industrial ecosystem that had made American military supremacy possible. The same factories that produced millions of soup cans with mathematical precision also manufactured 240 mm artillery shells with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, while the transportation networks that delivered processed food to soldiers in combat also carried the raw materials and finished products that supported the entire American war effort. This integration of civilian and military production reflected a level of industrial mobilization that German planners had not believed possible within democratic political systems. The standardization and quality control that ensured consistent taste and nutritional value in processed food also guaranteed that 240mm shells would perform exactly as designed when fired at targets 14 miles away, demonstrating the systematic application of American manufacturing excellence to every aspect of the war effort, from the most mundane to the most technically demanding. The psychological transformation of German military thinking continued throughout 1944 as American artillery demonstrated its capacity to eliminate any fortified position with mathematical precision. The time and resources invested in constructing elaborate defensive works came to represent not military assets, but historical curiosities, rendered meaningless by weapons that could obliterate the most sophisticated fortifications with single shells delivered from positions that placed American crews beyond the reach of any possible retaliation. The strategic implications extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations to encompass fundamental questions about Germany's ability to continue organized resistance against an enemy possessing such overwhelming technological advantages. The defensive strategy that had enabled German forces to extract maximum casualties from Allied advances had been rendered obsolete by weapons that eliminated fortified positions with surgical precision while expending minimal ammunition and exposing American forces to negligible risk. German military communications, intercepted throughout the Italian campaign, revealed a progression from initial disbelief through growing concern to ultimate despair as the systematic destruction of defensive positions continued with mechanical regularity. Unit commanders who had spent months preparing elaborate fortifications were forced to recommend immediate evacuation of positions that could no longer provide protection against weapons of such devastating power, leading to the collapse of entire defensive lines without the prolonged battles that had characterized earlier phases of the campaign. The 240mm howitzer had accomplished more than the destruction of specific military targets. It had demonstrated the futility of resistance against an enemy whose industrial capabilities exceeded German comprehension. Each shell fired represented not just destructive power, but the accumulated might of American factories, research laboratories, and engineering expertise applied to the problem of projecting overwhelming force across vast distances with unprecedented accuracy. The sound of the Black Dragon's roar carried within it the voice of American democracy speaking in its most elemental language, the mathematics of high explosives, delivered with surgical precision by weapons that embodied the complete mobilization of free society for the Kyoto prosecution of total war. The transformation accomplished in the hills around Mignano would continue across multiple theaters of operation as German defenders gradually came to understand that they were confronting not merely superior weapons, but the full industrial and technological power of American democracy expressed through military systems that transcended their understanding of what was technically possible. The age of fortress warfare was ending, concluded not through gradual obsolescence, but through revolutionary demonstration of weapons that rendered all previous defensive calculations meaningless. As German intelligence officers compiled reports about American artillery capabilities, they were forced to confront evidence of technological superiority so overwhelming that it challenged their fundamental assumptions about the nature of modern warfare. The resources invested in producing a single 240mm shell exceeded the total artillery ammunition budget for entire German divisions, while the precision with which these shells were delivered to their targets reflected manufacturing tolerances and quality control procedures that German industry could no longer achieve under any circumstances. The Korean War would provide final confirmation of the 240 mm Howitzer's psychological impact when Chinese forces encountered the weapon for the first time in 1953. On May 1st of that year, the first ceremonial round fired by Baker Battery of the 213th Field Artillery Battalion struck an ammunition dump on a hill designated the Donut by aerial observers, setting off a chain reaction that blew the top off the hill in spectacular fashion. The demonstration had been intended as a symbolic gesture, but it achieved devastating practical results that reinforced the weapon's reputation as the most feared artillery piece of the era. Chinese prisoners, captured following 240 mm bombardments, described psychological effects identical to those reported by German survivors: the complete breakdown of confidence in defensive positions, the linguistic inability to adequately describe destruction on such a scale, and the recognition that resistance against weapons of such power was psychologically impossible to sustain. The consistency of these reactions across different theaters and enemy forces confirmed that the 240 mm Howitzer had achieved effects that transcended cultural and ideological boundaries to encompass universal human responses to destruction beyond the scale of normal comprehension. The industrial abundance that sustained American artillery operations continued to serve as a recurring symbol of democratic superiority throughout the conflict, as the simple act of consuming processed food produced thousands of miles from the battlefield demonstrated the depth and reliability of American logistics networks. German soldiers who had learned to subsist on ersatz substitutes and foraged supplements found themselves confronting an enemy whose supply systems could deliver factory-fresh products to the most remote combat zones, reflecting an industrial capacity that rendered conventional resource calculations meaningless. The mathematical precision with which American artillery engaged its targets represented more than superior engineering. It embodied the systematic application of scientific methodology to the problem of warfare, supported by educational systems that produced artillery officers capable of calculating, firing solutions with slide rule accuracy, and manufacturing systems that could produce shells and propellant charges to specifications that ensured consistent performance under the most demanding combat conditions. The integration of theoretical knowledge and practical application that characterized American military doctrine reflected broader cultural values that emphasized innovation, experimentation, and the relentless pursuit of technical excellence. The transformation of European battlefields under the impact of American artillery fire marked the end of military traditions that had dominated warfare for centuries, as castles and fortifications gave way to weapons that could eliminate any fixed position with mathematical certainty. The psychological adjustment required for military professionals to accept this new reality was profound and often traumatic, as officers who had devoted their careers to mastering the art of defensive warfare were forced to confront the obsolescence of everything they had learned about the protective power of concrete and steel. The 240 mm Howitzer stood as a monument to American technological achievement and industrial supremacy. Representing more than superior firepower, it embodied the successful mobilization of democratic society for the purpose of projecting overwhelming military power across global distances. The precision with which these weapons operated reflected not just superior engineering, but the systematic application of scientific methodology to military problems, supported by manufacturing capabilities that could produce weapons and ammunition to specifications that exceeded the technical capabilities of any other nation on Earth. The silence that followed each 240 mm strike carried within it the sound of history turning, as the fortress walls that had defined European warfare for millennia were shattered by weapons that embodied the industrial might of American democracy. The mathematics of destruction had been rewritten by forces that transcended conventional military understanding, announcing the arrival of a new era in which technological supremacy, rather than tactical innovation, would determine the fate of nations and the outcome of wars. In the smoking ruins of what had been Germany's most formidable defensive positions, the future of warfare had been written in the language of high explosives and precision manufacturing. The Black Dragon had spoken with a voice that no concrete wall could ignore, delivering lessons in modern military capabilities that would echo through the corridors of military academies and defense ministries for generations to come, while the canned soup consumed by American artillery crews continued to symbolize the industrial abundance that had made such weapons possible and the democratic values that had guided their development and employment. The ultimate lesson of the 240mm howitzer was both military and philosophical, that free societies, when fully mobilized for warfare, could project power with a precision and devastating effectiveness that exceeded the capabilities of any authoritarian system, regardless of its tactical sophistication or defensive preparations. The democracy of destruction demonstrated by American artillery represented more than superior weapons. It embodied the triumph of industrial innovation and scientific methodology over military tradition and fortified resistance, writing the final chapter in the age of fortress warfare with 360-pound exclamation points delivered across vast distances with the accuracy of mechanical clockwork and the power of controlled lightning, announcing to the world that the marriage of American industrial capacity and democratic values had produced weapons capable of reshaping the very foundations of military conflict through the simple expedient of overwhelming technological superiority applied with mathematical precision to the ancient art of war, the sound that Hans Dietrich had heard growing louder in that Italian morning was not simply the approach of another artillery shell, it was the voice of the future announcing its arrival, carrying within its impossible dimensions the promise that American democracy possessed weapons capable of obliterating any obstacle that tyranny could construct, speaking in the universal language of high explosives with an authority that transcended national boundaries and ideological differences to deliver the final word on the mathematics of modern warfare. The age of the impregnable bunker was over, ended not by gradual obsolescence, but by the thunderous announcement that freedom, when fully armed with the products of American industry and innovation, possessed the power to reshape the world itself through the concentrated application of democratic values expressed in steel and explosive and delivered with the precision of scientific calculation across the vast distances that separated democracy from its enemies. In the end, the 240mm howitzer achieved something far greater than military victory. It demonstrated that the industrial and technological superiority of free societies could produce weapons so devastating in their effectiveness and so precise in their application that resistance became not merely futile but psychologically impossible, leaving behind only silence where once the thunder of American democracy had spoken its final, irrefutable verdict on the ultimate futility of opposing the concentrated will of free peoples fully mobilized for the defense of liberty and the advancement of human freedom through the ancient but ever-evolving mathematics of war.